intentionality that goes around why we archive, why we access, and for what purpose. So bringing the community, bringing people back into the discussion was critically important. It made us think and talk about this broader dynamic or ecology that we're all operating in here that includes the GLAM sector, galleries, libraries, museums and archives, and we actually didn't talk about land and environment, but I think that the GLAM sector really wants to move in that direction anyway, but also communities, language, intergenerational knowledge, women and children. We started thinking about people, actual people, and the applications for retrieving and engaging with archives and data. It just kept coming back to that. When we spoke about AI and when we spoke about big kind of digital trends in this way, we just kept coming back to this longer term vision and view of collective cultural knowledges, community cultural knowledges, and trying to recenter the human back into the yarn. Talking in such a way had everyone really energised, which is also, I think, important to note, because these conversations can and sometimes do have a tendency to kind of go down pathways that could be overly technical, could be deploying language that, some of us around the table know, some of us don't know, but being mindful of what it means to establish principles that are all agreed upon, and really have permission and courage to ask ourselves, well, what do you mean by rematriation, or what do you mean by repatriation? Is there another way? Just creating permission and permission spaces to be able to kind of recalibrate or start from the same point. And we must realise that we're all not at the same point, and that establishment, of what do you mean when you talk about data, or what do you mean when you talk about AI even, are all conversations that need to be had. Another word that we all agreed upon was well-being and inner being, and this sense and idea that, this recognition of the value and importance for that being one of the guiding intentions behind why we do this. Feeding, nurturing, regeneration, bringing the human again back into the yarn. Another really important dimension which weaves through all of this is governance. So we spoke about governance and how important governance is, and that came about through a discussion which we had where we asked ourselves the question, what is it that Australia and the Australian context can offer the world with regards to how we're engaging with data and archiving, and particularly the relationship between settler colonial Australians and First Nations Australians, and if there's something there. I mean, even hearing today how we're all yarning and the kind of language that we're using, there must be a unique value proposition that we have to the world with regards to this, and how we recenter and reorient the human within this broader discussion. So it was really nice, and we got to know each other a little bit more through the yarn. So thank you.
Thank you, Kristen and Magali.
Sure. Okay.
Very good.
It's on? No.
Should be. Was on.
I'll probably turn it off. There we go.
There you go.
We similarly had quite a broad-ranging discussion. We did focus more on the first two questions, but I think we brought a lot of elements of the third question into our discussion. I guess we got quite targeted. We did always come back to that element that it needs to be a human-centered response in all of these. because it often gets forgotten in technical spaces when there is a lot of progression. I know myself coming into the world of data and data science and technical data architecture, I was often confused with the language, and still am, I'll admit that. It's even looking at all different disciplines, we use different languages, even within the English language. So we did get into a discussion about not just how we speak about this, but when we are developing different technical solutions for all of this, we have to be really mindful of the way that both the technical people who are engaging in it, that they have a greater understanding. I know personally we've worked with our technical team extensively. We now speak similar languages. We'll see if Nick agrees with that. But it's really important for a variety of different reasons. A specific example was talking about looking at future ways of how we can work better together and how we can use different technical processes to do that, was the real importance of thinking through language in the way we set up these technical facilities. So whether it is, if we're working, for example, in Yumata, there needs to be ways that, not just a keyboard, but ways of our different systems to recognise one another and different languages to be recognised within these systems. Similarly, it was brought up that there are some parts of the German language that can be quite difficult. So I guess it also speaks to the interoperability, and we really have to think this through in many more ways than just can be rushed into and just create a system without thinking about these contexts. We also talked about the importance of having, again, getting back to a bit of a technical issue, but if we're thinking about ways of protecting and preserving knowledge and data, that there really has to be standardised metadata tools, which hopefully Nick will talk to a little bit about how we've been thinking through that in our project. But in order to have any sort of coordinated approach across Australia, we need to have some shared language that is useful and acceptable for everyone across all sectors. We also had a short discussion about language preservation, and preservation not necessarily being the right word either. Preservation often speaks to the archival holding things of the past and not thinking about the future again. So we had quite a considerate amount of time speaking about the way we use language and what it means for different people. We also, Michael spoke about the Jalkari keeping place, and we had a bit of a discussion about, he said that it actually has been a very useful tool, correct me if I'm wrong, Michael, in terms of getting access to material locally that you wouldn't otherwise be able to have access to, but it's also important for artists to be able to go and see the objects in other places. So you were just speaking about your trip to the National Gallery and the museum, but also in other institutions in Paris. But we also had conversations that one of the things that other sectors have done relatively well, and has been emerging, is training local people to do this sort of work. So for example, Indigenous rangers, you were saying that there has been a lot of good training where local people go and get trained and then they come and retain in community. Similarly, we've seen across Australia this happening in the health sector, but we haven't really seen this emerge so much when we're thinking about whether it's data, these keeping places for knowledge and data in art, museums and galleries, building that local capacity in local areas, whether it's in the local art organisations or whether it's in other local organisations. We really need to think about building that capacity. So we discussed that. We also talked about the tensions. We moved on to question 2. So Gay was speaking about how, from a museum's perspective, there tends to be 2 approaches to whether information about the works goes online. So it either is the approach of, as Gay actually, I'll quote you here. It's I can't put the data online as I don't have the permission, so no data goes online. Or the alternative is putting everything up and saying we'll take it down if someone asks us to take it down. And so resolving these sorts of tensions, we all discussed that is a priority, because neither of those approaches are necessarily particularly good, especially the first. The other thing that we did speak to at a bit of length, and Howard was discussing how really, again, getting back to those people perspectives, researchers and institutions cannot come into communities with any preconceived notions of how things should be. There really needs to be this slowdown of the processes so that people locally are driving these processes. And these conversations have to be done the right way. So Michael and Jason agreed that, you can't just go and speak to one elder or have a preconceived notion that you speak to the women first or the men first. You need to seek advice and not enforce anything that you think as an institution or as a researcher or as a gallery or museum about the way things should be. Locally, it's always going to be contextually different. Did you have extra things?
Just maybe the last point was about thinking about the future and thinking about the kind of long-term sustainability of some very important databases that have been built in the past, or the one which are currently under construction. And there were some issues. It seems that some institutions have cut budget or cutting budget, or we all know about that, and that we can be put at risk. These very important databases or knowledge that has been worked for a very long time now, and how references. So the issue of, and you were talking about what you did do.
Yeah, so we did discuss, and this comes up time and again at a lot of our events that we hold, is that, again, whether it's specific research projects or whether it is specific institutions who have gathered a lot of data that don't have this long-term planning of where that's going to be kept or where it's going to be held, there needs to be a greater national conversation about where we can hold and keep this data. We have, in the context of this project at the IDN, we do not see it as being the long-term solution, but we have set up a repository for at-risk, or what we're calling orphan databases, because there is a huge amount of nationally significant data that will be lost if there is nowhere to keep it. Marcia can probably talk about some of our long-term vision. We've got it sitting there. I'm sure there's other people who have ideas about this as well. We've been of the perspective that IATSIS needs to have a national keeping place of data. So we're doing what we see as an interim solution whilst we think through where that needs to be. So that was another thing. Is there anything else that we missed?
I mentioned the website that's at risk.
Oh yes, you did.
No, I'm just going to say, for those who don't know, the Spencer and Gillen website that took years and years to build, it's got amazing films, photographs, manuscripts. It's the holding institution at the moment. I think it's gone down offline because there's budget cuts and we can't really afford to keep it going. So my colleagues have been having discussions, because it would be catastrophic for the people in Central Australia and Northern Australia if that website got lost with all the data.
Well, I think we talked about, I think my table doesn't disagree, but we weren't as personal. We were talking more about, I think, legislation, the technicalities, about bean counters and budgets and things, switches can get turned off, as Nick was explaining, massive amounts of data. And also about the legislation, about institutions who are legislated to protect X amount of data, and they do a lot more than that, but what if someone decides that they have to go back, you know, worry about the budget and stop doing the extra work, the extra things they're protecting? What if, you know, a bad museum director or a bad state premier or whatever just says cut, you know? And I guess that's what's happening in America all over the country. So, so I guess, and we had good examples, you know, with Gillian talking from an institutional point of view that seems to be on top of a lot of these things and has good policies. Jennifer talking about as an independent person who has a researcher who has a massive archive, where will that end up? You know, and of course backwards and forwards between all these discussions about legislation, budgets, technicality. I guess Nick was also talking about the possibility of big corporations who might be, or big government departments or big corporations that may perchance be sitting on a massive amount of unused data which could be used for X amount of time. And I guess the length of time is important as well. Sometimes, you know, some solutions may be very good in the short term until a bit, like you're talking orphan data, you know. So, Marcia, any comments?
Okay, just to pick up on that point. So, yeah, that point was about storage. Some big institutions have lots of storage and a role for the IDN, or there is a role that somebody has to fill in any case, to negotiate or be the intermediary as a trusted impartial unit to secure storage under the right conditions. So for instance, the entity offering the storage is not affected in the future by improper sharing of data. So we all need to access storage. The remote area communities particularly, it's very expensive. So I think that's a key kind of institutional role that we have to fill in. Somebody mentioned, you know, destruction of data before. Lots of institutions destroy data. They destroy books. They, you know, dump books. How do we stop that? Well, I think the upshot of all of this was that many types of data that are not protected by legislation need to be protected in legislation, so that they're not destroyed by bean counters. Who will, you know, some institutions will try to force the government to fund them better or change their scope of work by destroying data to make their users really angry. Because petitions don't work anymore to raise money for, say, the National Library of Australia. So how can we prevent data from being destroyed? And it's also destroyed accidentally and out of sheer spite and so on. It probably needs to be protected. And so we need a system for establishing the storage criteria. Under what criteria do we want the storage to operate? And of course I'm repeating all the points made here by Nick Carr. How long for? What are you going to do with it? Evaluate storage options against storage criteria. And then there are the Indigenous restrictions placed by communities, and there was an extensive discussion of that. One of the discussions is pretty interesting. Ara Iridigya was raised, of course. Apparently it's up and running again. And then Joe Goombula's, the late Joe Goombula designed a system a long time ago, about 20 years ago, and it wasn't feasible to implement it back then. But it would be the kind of system that would protect all of the owners of data and users of data in, say, a Gupapoinu kinship system, so that, you know, everybody's rights are attributed and people are consulted fairly. It might be possible to establish that kind of system now. We should have I suggested that we have a look at our Iridigya and see what it offers us in terms of protecting Indigenous restrictions. You know, there are theses on it. It's got, you know, great reviews, seems to work. But the thing is, once the people who established it got old and wanted to retire and left, it collapsed, but it's back up on its feet now, so that's interesting. But we could do all of these things with our Indigenous Data Commons approach. And Nick also raised AI, so you could have AI processing of data and require that data be processed in a particular way to protect those, you know, that data that Indigenous people want protected. And maybe DeepSeek, the Chinese AI engine, is, you know, is a solution because it's cheap, really cheap. Even so, it would still need to be finessed by individuals. So we need updated access and ownership protocols. Michael, you raised a concern about some of these protocols being designed in, did you say reconciliation action plan frameworks?
Yes.
Yes. And they end up being more forms that restrict Indigenous access. And some of us wrote an article about that recently, the new protectors. So the questions, you know, in developing this Indigenous criteria should include, you know, can I find it, should I be given access? So, and Nick, you can talk about this on Friday. You talked about a use case study. So you run a use case through it to cover all contingencies. We need rights modelling systems, and you know that's essentially what we're talking about here. So the group and the scope of the group, e.g. something was produced by this group at this time, it's not time bound, it can be owned by the descendants. So our starting response is to create lists of Indigenous groups, and the answer is only as good as the identification, I presume, of the subgroup, such as Joe Gumbler did, such as they do in Irididja, to start to record what groups people are in order for them to have access or ownership, or appropriate levels of ownership and access. So we have subject agents who the data is about. Do we have the capability to have a database of subject agents in our data commons? So we're dealing with a lot of complex information, and so recording of information is, and in this, you know, scenario is a bit like native title, the native title regime you suggested there, Michael, quite so, where native title interests need to be represented by an incorporated body, and then there are huge fights, well, you all know about that. But you know, that can be evened out over time with better governance. So we probably need to pay attention to governance protocols so that we don't have that kind of, you know, conflict about who owns data. I mean, there's some communities where it's well and truly sorted, like Galawiku, you know, you have it sorted out, it's good. Irididja is another example where it's sorted out because there's a good system. So with the Irididja, it's Anamur people operating it, and they manage their own website, and people enter their own data actually. So I stopped taking notes at that point. Was there anything else that should be said?
I think we're over time, so we'll have the break and get ready for the next session.
Okay.
Thank you for everybody.